The clock had just struck 9:30 p.m. when Amara packed up her study materials at the Georgetown University Library. Her pre-law study group had run longer than usual, but with midterms approaching, every extra minute of preparation counted. As she walked to her car, a midnight blue Tesla her dad had insisted on for safety, she couldn't help but smile thinking about how her father always went the extra mile to protect her. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves rustled across the parking lot as she pulled out her keys. The Tesla's lights blinked in welcome, and she slid into the driver's seat, placing her heavy law books on the passenger side. Her dad's voice echoed in her head, reminding her of all the safety checks he'd taught her. Seatbelt first, check all mirrors, ensure doors are locked. Being the daughter of an FBI special agent meant these habits were second nature. The drive home was peaceful. The streets of Georgetown were quiet, with just a few students walking between the historic buildings and local cafes. Amara hummed along to her favorite R&B playlist, thinking about the mock trial competition coming up next week. She'd been preparing for months, and her professors said she had a real shot at winning. As she turned onto the bridge heading towards Virginia, the city lights reflected off the Potomac River like scattered diamonds. This was her favorite part of the drive, the moment when Washington, D.C.'s monuments lit up the night sky behind her and the quieter suburbs beckoned ahead. Her house was just 15 minutes away, and she was already looking forward to the late-night snack her mom always left in the fridge for her. Amara was a careful driver, she always had been. Her father's position at the FBI meant she understood the importance of following rules better than most. Every stop sign, every speed limit, every traffic signal was observed with precision. She'd never even had a parking ticket. That's why she was so surprised when she saw the red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Her heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear, but from confusion. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. The Tesla's dashboard camera was recording everything, another safety measure her dad had insisted on. Following procedure perfectly, she turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over to the right side of the quiet suburban street. Through her side mirror, she watched as the police officer stepped out of his patrol car. Something felt off about his approach. He seemed tense, aggressive even, with his hand already resting on his weapon. Amara took a deep breath, remembering her father's advice. Stay calm, be respectful, and document everything. Little did she know that this routine traffic stop was about to change not just her life, but the entire police department's future. The next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of hidden misconduct and transform an entire system from within. Her fingers instinctively went to the emergency alert button her father had installed under the dashboard, another of his safety measures that she'd always thought was a bit excessive. But for the first time since he'd installed it, she was grateful for her father's overcautious nature. As the officer's heavy footsteps approached her window, Amara took another deep breath, straightened her posture, and prepared herself for what should have been a routine interaction. The streetlights cast long shadows through her car windows, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. It was just another quiet night in suburban Virginia, or at least it was supposed to be. But sometimes the biggest changes in history start with the smallest moments, and this ordinary traffic stop was about to become anything but ordinary. The police officer's flashlight beam cut through her car window like a laser, temporarily blinding Amara. She squinted, keeping her hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The beam bounced off her rearview mirror, illuminating her Georgetown University parking pass and the small photo of her family clipped to her stun visor. License and registration, the officer barked, his voice harsh and demanding. Something about his tone made Amara's stomach twist into knots. This wasn't the professional courtesy she was used to from law enforcement officers who regularly visited her home for dinner with her FBI agent father. Yes, officer, Amara replied calmly, making sure to narrate her movements. I'm going to reach for my registration in the glove compartment now, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. But before she could even move, the officer's reaction shocked her. Don't move, he shouted, his hand now fully gripping his weapon. Keep your hands where I can see them. The Tesla's cameras were silently recording everything. The officer's aggressive stance, his unnecessarily loud commands, the way his flashlight beam shook slightly as his hand trembled with what seemed like barely contained anger. "Officer," Amara tried again, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I understand your concerns for safety. Would you prefer to take my purse out yourself to find my license?" "I just want to comply with your request in whatever way makes you most comfortable." Her response, though perfectly reasonable, seemed to agitate him further. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, already reaching for her door handle. The interior lights of her car illuminated his name tag, Officer P. Wilson. Amara's mind raced. Her father had taught her about situations like this. When an officer's behavior becomes unpredictable, the best defense is documentation and compliance while maintaining your rights. She pressed the emergency alert button under her dashboard before carefully following his instructions. The autumn air felt colder now as she stepped out of her car. A few houses had their porch lights on, and she could see curious faces peeking through windows. 2 teenagers across the street had already pulled out their phones, sensing something wasn't right. "You ran that stop sign back there," Officer Wilson claimed, his voice filled with unwarranted hostility. "And I bet this isn't even your car, is it? Pretty expensive vehicle for someone your age." Amara knew there was no stop sign on her route. She'd driven this road hundreds of times. The Tesla's dashboard camera would prove that. She also knew what this was really about, and it had nothing to do with traffic violations. "Sir, this is my father's car, and I can prove ownership," she said calmly. "And I respectfully disagree about the stop sign. Your dashboard camera and my car's cameras will show that I came to a complete stop at every traffic sign on my route." A small crowd was gathering now. More phones were recording. Someone was live streaming. Officer Wilson seemed to notice too, but instead of calming his behavior, the audience appeared to make him more aggressive. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're being detained for resisting an officer." "I'm not resisting, sir," Amara stated clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by all the recording devices present. "I'm complying with all your commands. I'd like to contact my father, who is an FBI special agent, and I have the right to make that call." The mention of FBI should have given Officer Wilson pause. Instead, he roughly grabbed her wrists, the handcuffs clicking shut with unnecessary force. The cold metal bit into her skin, but Amara remained composed, knowing that every second of this interaction was being recorded from multiple angles. In the distance, more police sirens wailed. Someone, probably one of the neighbors, had called for backup. But Amara knew the cavalry that was really coming would be wearing FBI windbreakers, not police uniforms. Her father had installed that emergency alert button for a reason, and right now, it was sending real-time video footage to his phone. As Officer Wilson roughly guided her toward his patrol car, Amara held her head high. She wasn't just thinking about herself anymore. She was thinking about every person who'd ever been in this situation without the privileges and protections she had. Her father had always taught her that true justice comes through the system, not despite it. Tonight, she would help prove him right. The back seat of the police car was cold and uncomfortable, but Amara's discomfort wasn't physical. It was the weight of injustice pressing down on her shoulders. Through the window, she could see her Tesla sitting there, its cameras still faithfully recording everything. A small crowd had gathered now, their phone lights dotting the darkness like fireflies. "Hey, I'm live streaming this," a young woman called out, holding her phone steady. "We've got you covered, sister. Don't worry." Others nodded in agreement, their phones capturing every moment of this unfolding scene. The community wasn't just watching, they were bearing witness. Officer Wilson was pacing now, clearly agitated by the growing crowd. His backup hadn't arrived yet, but the sound of distant sirens was getting closer. What he didn't know was that those sirens belonged to more than just local police. Amara's emergency alert had set a different kind of response in motion. "You're making a big mistake," Amara said calmly through the patrol car's open window. "My father is expecting me home, and when I don't arrive, he'll know exactly where to find me." Her voice was steady, but her heart was racing. The handcuffs were uncomfortably tight, and she could feel them leaving marks on her wrists. A neighbor had brought out their phone and was playing back the video they'd captured of the entire stop. "There's no stop sign anywhere near here," they announced loudly. "I've lived on this street for 20 years. Others murmured in agreement, and more people began checking their phones, pulling up maps to verify this fact. Officer Wilson's body camera was still recording as he returned to his patrol car. His muttered comments, caught clearly by the camera's microphone, would later become crucial evidence. "These people think they can drive whatever they want, live wherever they want," he grumbled, revealing his true motivations for the stop. The first backup unit arrived, 2 younger officers who immediately sensed something was wrong. They took in the scene: the expensive Tesla with its cameras, the crowd of witnesses with their phones, and a well-dressed college student handcuffed in the back of a patrol car. One of them approached Officer Wilson, while the other scanned the growing crowd of neighbors. "What's the charge?" the younger officer asked Wilson, his body camera picking up every word. "Resisting arrest and running a stop sign," Wilson replied, but his voice wavered slightly. The younger officer's eyes narrowed. He knew this street well enough to know there was no stop sign. Just then, a black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner, moving with purpose. Amara allowed herself a small smile. She recognized that vehicle. The crowd parted as it pulled up, and 2 people stepped out, their FBI windbreakers clearly visible under the streetlights. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Officer Wilson's confident demeanor crumbled as one of the FBI agents held up their badge. "I'm Special Agent Chen with the FBI," the agent announced, their voice carrying across the now quiet street. "And I believe you have my daughter in the back of your patrol car." The younger officers immediately stepped back, understanding the gravity of the situation. The crowd whispered and pointed as more FBI vehicles arrived, their occupants moving with the precise efficiency of a well-coordinated federal response. "Officer Wilson," Agent Chen continued, "I'm going to need those handcuffs removed from my daughter immediately. And then we're going to have a very interesting conversation about probable cause, abuse of power, and the numerous federal civil rights violations I've just witnessed via my daughter's car cameras." As one of the younger officers quickly moved to release Amara, she caught a glimpse of Officer Wilson's face. The realization was dawning on him. This traffic stop wasn't going to be buried in paperwork or dismissed by sympathetic superiors. This time, he had picked the wrong target, and the consequences would ripple far beyond this quiet suburban street. Amara rubbed her wrists as she was released, but she held her head high. The crowd of neighbors applauded as she walked toward her father. But even in this moment of personal relief, she was thinking bigger. She turned to the young woman who'd been live streaming. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you all for being witnesses. This isn't just about me, it's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." The neighbors nodded solemnly, understanding that they had just played a part in something much larger than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. As FBI agents began collecting witness statements and video evidence, Amara knew this was just the beginning. Her father's hand on her shoulder was reassuring, but his expression was focused, determined. This wasn't going to be about revenge. It was going to be about reform, about using the system to fix the system. The next morning, Special Agent Chen sat in his office at the FBI headquarters, his coffee growing cold as he reviewed the footage from last night's incident. The wall of monitors before him displayed multiple angles: his daughter's Tesla cameras, Officer Wilson's body camera, and dozens of citizen videos that had been uploaded to social media overnight. But something wasn't sitting right. 20 years of FBI experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming that this wasn't an isolated incident. He pulled up Officer Wilson's service record, and what he found made his blood run cold. "You need to see this," he called to his partner, Agent Rivera, who had been with the Civil Rights Division for 15 years. She walked over, coffee in hand, and leaned in to look at his screen. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the data. 17 complaints in 5 years, she whispered, shaking her head. All swept under the rug. All involving minority drivers. And these are just the ones who dared to file formal complaints. The office buzzed with activity around them, but in their corner, a heavy silence fell. They both knew what this meant. What had started as a personal incident involving his daughter had just become something much bigger. Agent Chen pulled up the police department's internal database, access that had been granted due to the ongoing investigation. As he dug deeper, patterns emerged. Traffic stops that didn't match reported locations. Arrests with charges that were later quietly dropped. Complaint forms that somehow never made it to internal affairs. "Look at this," Agent Rivera pointed to a particular file. A college student last year. Same location, same alleged stop sign violation, same officer. She pulled up more files. And here, 3 months ago. And again last month. He's been using the same fake stop sign excuse on that street repeatedly. A young FBI analyst knocked on their office door, carrying a thick stack of papers. "Sir, you asked for the social media analysis." She laid out printouts of community forums, neighborhood apps, and local Facebook groups. Dozens of similar stories emerged. People who had been too afraid to file formal complaints but had shared their experiences online. Agent Chen's phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. She had just finished giving her official statement at the local FBI field office. Her message read, "Dad, my friend from study group saw the video. She says the same thing happened to her cousin last summer. Same officer, same street." He turned to the wall of monitors, now displaying a map of all reported incidents involving Officer Wilson, red dots clustered around certain neighborhoods, forming a clear pattern of targeted harassment. "We need to go bigger," Agent Rivera said, already reaching for her phone. "This isn't just about one officer anymore. The whole complaint system in that department is compromised. Someone's been burying these reports." Agent Chen nodded, pulling up the department's organizational chart. Names and faces filled the screen. Supervisors, internal affairs officers, department heads. Somewhere in this chain of command, someone had been enabling Wilson's behavior. "Start with the shift supervisors," he said, marking names on his tablet. Anyone who would have reviewed these incidents. Then work up the chain. Someone had to sign off on dismissing all these complaints. His phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. The video of his daughter's arrest had gone viral. National media was picking up the story. FBI agent's daughter unlawfully arrested, reveals pattern of police misconduct. "Sir," another analyst called from the doorway. "The Civil Rights Division chief wants to see you, and the U.S. Attorney's office is on line 1. Agent Chen stood up, straightening his tie. This case was about to blow wide open, but his face showed no satisfaction or triumph, only determination. This wasn't about revenge for what happened to his daughter. This was about all the people who didn't have an FBI agent for a parent, who didn't have cameras recording their traffic stops, who didn't have the power to fight back. As he walked to the division chief's office, he passed the FBI's motto mounted on the wall: fidelity, bravery, integrity. Today, those words carried extra weight. His daughter's incident had opened a door, and now it was his job to make sure it stayed open until every hidden injustice was brought to light. The next few hours would be crucial. Warrants needed to be drafted, witnesses contacted, evidence secured. But for the first time in years, the people who had suffered under Officer Wilson's abuse of power would have what they'd been denied for so long: a real investigation and a chance for justice. The FBI's Civil Rights Division office was buzzing with activity at 7 a.m. the next morning. Agent Chen had barely slept, but adrenaline kept him going as he stood before a wall of evidence. Photos, documents, and timeline charts covered every inch of space, connected by red strings that showed the links between cases. "The pattern goes back further than we thought," Agent Rivera announced, walking in with a fresh stack of files. "I've got cases from 7 years ago. Same officer, same tactics, different neighborhoods." She pinned more photos to the wall, each one representing someone whose voice had been ignored. The team had set up a special hotline yesterday, and the phones hadn't stopped ringing since. People who had been afraid to speak up before were finally finding their courage. Each call added another piece to the puzzle. "You'll want to hear this," a young agent called out, covering his phone's microphone. "I've got a former desk sergeant on the line. Says he tried to report Officer Wilson 3 years ago. Claims his superiors told him to lose the paperwork." Agent Chen nodded, grabbing his jacket. "Get his statement. I want to meet him in person." He turned to Rivera. "Keep digging into those department heads. Someone's been signing off on all this." As he drove to meet the former sergeant, his car radio buzzed with news about the case. The story had exploded overnight. National news networks were running the footage of his daughter's arrest on repeat. Social media was flooded with similar stories from across the country. The coffee shop where they met was quiet, tucked away in a corner of town. The former sergeant, now working as a security guard, looked nervously over his shoulder as he spoke. It wasn't just Wilson, he explained, stirring his untouched coffee. There was a whole system in place. They had a code for it, special handling. When certain officers made stops, their paperwork went through different channels. Back at the office, more evidence poured in. A junior officer who'd recently transferred spoke up about missing dashcam footage. A clerk from records management revealed how complaint files would mysteriously disappear. A retired internal affairs investigator finally broke his silence about cases that were shut down before they could begin. Agent Chen's daughter stopped by the office that afternoon, still wearing her Georgetown Law sweatshirt. She'd been working with law students to help catalog witness statements. "Dad," she said, pointing to her laptop, "we've found 50 more cases. People are sharing their stories on social media. They're not afraid anymore." The investigation had taken on a life of its own. What started as one traffic stop had uncovered years of systematic abuse. The wall of evidence now stretched across 3 rooms. Red strings crisscrossed between photos, showing connections that had been invisible before. "Look at this," Rivera called out, waving a document. Wilson's performance reviews, all glowing, all signed by the same supervisor. She pulled up more files on her computer. And that supervisor? He's been promoting officers with similar complaint patterns. The pieces were falling into place. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about a culture of protection and silence. The team worked through the night, following paper trails, interviewing witnesses, connecting dots that had been deliberately scattered. Agent Chen stood back, looking at the evidence wall. His daughter's case was just one photo now, connected to dozens of others. Each string led to another story, another voice that deserved to be heard. The investigation had become bigger than any personal vendetta. It was about changing a system that had failed too many people for too long. Late that night, as most of the team headed home, he received a text from his daughter. "Found more witnesses from my study group. They're ready to talk. We're making a difference, Dad." He smiled, thinking how this case had transformed from a father protecting his daughter into something much more important. It was about all the parents who couldn't protect their children, all the voices that had been silenced, all the reports that had been buried. The next morning would bring search warrants, interviews with department heads, and more revelations. But for now, Agent Chen took a moment to add one more red string to the wall, connecting another dot in the pattern of injustice they were finally bringing to light. The investigation wasn't just about punishing bad behavior anymore. It was about changing the system from within, about giving people back their voices, about making sure that next time someone filed a complaint, it wouldn't disappear into a drawer. Real change was coming, one piece of evidence at a time. The morning sun was just rising over the city when dozens of FBI agents in dark windbreakers moved simultaneously across the police department. They carried search warrants and evidence boxes, their footsteps echoing through the suddenly quiet hallways. This wasn't just another day at the office. This was the moment when everything would change. Agent Chen stood in the police chief's office, watching as his team carefully catalogued and boxed up years of hidden files. The chief sat silently at his desk, his face ashen as he realized the full scope of what was happening. The wall behind him, once covered with commendations and awards, now stood bare. "We found the missing complaint files," Agent Rivera announced, walking in with a thick folder. They were hidden in a locked cabinet in the basement. Hundreds of them, going back almost a decade. She placed the folder on the desk, where it landed with a heavy thud that seemed to echo the weight of its contents. Down the hall, in the Internal Affairs office, another team was imaging computers and copying hard drives. Years of buried evidence were coming to light with each click and whir of their equipment. An IT specialist called out from behind a monitor, "Sir, you need to see this." They had a separate email system for handling these cases. The evidence was damning. A parallel system had been created specifically to bury complaints against certain officers. It was sophisticated, systematic, and completely illegal. What had started with Officer Wilson had led them to something far bigger. A conspiracy of silence that stretched through multiple levels of department leadership. Back at FBI headquarters, Agent Chen's daughter had organized a team of law students to help process the flood of new witness statements. The hotline they'd set up was ringing constantly now. People who had been afraid to speak up before were finding their courage, knowing that this time someone was actually listening. "Look at this pattern," one student called out, pointing to a map on their screen. Red dots showed reported incidents, forming clear clusters around certain neighborhoods. They were targeting specific communities, and the complaints from these areas were the ones most likely to disappear. The media had caught wind of the scale of the investigation. News vans lined the street outside the police department, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, Agent Chen watched as another box of evidence was carried out, knowing that each document represented someone who had been wronged by the system. "We've got officers coming forward now," Rivera reported, handing up her phone. "Young ones, rookies who were told to keep quiet if they wanted to keep their badges. They're ready to talk about what they saw, what they were told to do." The investigation had taken on a momentum of its own. What started as one traffic stop had cracked open years of systematic abuse. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reform, about making sure the system worked the way it was supposed to. That afternoon, Agent Chen stood before a room full of FBI agents, police officers who had come forward, community leaders, and legal experts. The wall behind him was covered with evidence, photos, documents, timelines, all connected by those red strings that showed the pattern of abuse. "This isn't about taking down one department," he explained, his voice firm. "This is about building a better one. We're not just removing bad officers, we're creating new systems to make sure this never happens again." The plan was comprehensive: new oversight committees with community representatives, mandatory body camera reviews, an independent complaint review board, and a complete overhaul of the internal affairs process. Every step was designed not just to punish past misconduct, but to prevent future abuse. Late that night, as the office slowly emptied, Agent Chen found his daughter still at her desk, surrounded by case files and witness statements. "You know," she said, looking up from her work, "when this happened to me, I was scared. But now?" She gestured at the wall of evidence, at all the stories they'd uncovered. "Now I'm hopeful. We're actually changing things." He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. This case had become something bigger than either of them had imagined. It wasn't just about justice for one person, it was about justice for everyone who'd ever been silenced, everyone who'd ever been told their voice didn't matter. The next day would bring more revelations, more evidence, more stories of abuse and cover-ups. But it would also bring hope. Every file they uncovered, every witness who spoke up, every officer who found the courage to break the code of silence, they were all part of something bigger. They were part of real change, happening one document, one testimony, one brave voice at a time. And somewhere in the city, other police departments were watching, learning, and hopefully realizing that the old system of silence and protection was coming to an end. A new day was dawning in law enforcement, and it started with one traffic stop that went wrong. Or maybe, in the end, went exactly right. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the courthouse was packed. Every seat was filled as Officer Wilson and 3 senior department officials stood before the judge. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about change. Agent Chen sat in the front row beside his daughter, who was furiously taking notes for her law school paper on police reform. Around them sat dozens of community members who had come forward during the investigation, each one representing a story that had finally been heard. "In all my years on the bench," the judge began, her voice clear and strong, "I've never seen such a comprehensive case of systematic abuse of power." She looked directly at the defendants. But what's even more remarkable is what this case has sparked in terms of reform. The evidence had been overwhelming. Hundreds of buried complaints, dozens of falsified reports, a complex system designed to protect officers who abused their power. But today wasn't just about exposing wrongdoing, it was about making sure it never happened again. The judge continued, outlining the sweeping changes that had already begun. The department had been completely reorganized. New oversight committees were in place, half-staffed by community members. Every complaint would now be reviewed by an independent board. Body cameras were mandatory, and the footage would be regularly audited by civilian reviewers. "Officer Wilson," the judge addressed him directly, "you are hereby stripped of your badge and will serve time for your actions. But more importantly, your case has become a catalyst for change across the country." she was right. In the months since the investigation began, police departments nationwide had started examining their own complaint procedures. The case had become a blueprint for reform, showing how real change could happen from within the system. Outside the courthouse, Agent Chen's daughter spoke to a crowd of reporters and community members. This case was never about revenge, she explained, her voice steady. It was about making sure that what happened to me couldn't happen to anyone else. And today, we've taken a huge step toward that goal. The changes were already visible. The police department had new leadership, chosen through a process that included community input. Training programs had been completely revamped, with a focus on de-escalation and cultural awareness. Every officer now went through regular reviews, including analysis of their stop and arrest patterns. But perhaps the biggest change was in the community itself. People who had been afraid to speak up before now had a voice. The new Civilian Oversight Board met regularly, and its meetings were always full. Trust was being rebuilt, one interaction at a time. A month later, Agent Chen stood before a class of new police recruits. The training academy had asked him to share the lessons learned from the case. Looking at the fresh faces before him, he saw hope for the future. Your badge is not just a symbol of authority, he told them. It's a symbol of trust. And trust has to be earned every day, with every interaction, with every decision you make. The recruits listened intently as he explained the new systems in place. The oversight committees, the review boards, the community involvement. But more importantly, he talked about responsibility and the courage to speak up when something was wrong. Back at Georgetown Law School, his daughter had started a new program connecting law students with community members who needed help navigating the justice system. The small traffic stop that had started everything had grown into something much bigger. A movement for real, lasting change. 1 year to the day after the traffic stop, a new community police center opened in the neighborhood where it had all happened. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by both police officers and community members. The walls inside displayed photos showing the history of the department, including the dark times they were leaving behind. But more prominently, they showed the path forward, community meetings, joint training sessions, civilian oversight boards in action. Agent Chen watched as his daughter chatted with a group of young officers and community leaders. They were planning joint workshops, creating bridges between law enforcement and the people they served. This was what real change looked like, not just new rules and procedures, but new relationships and understanding. The case had shown that one person's stand for justice could spark a movement, but it had also shown that lasting change requires everyone to work together: law enforcement, community members, oversight boards, and yes, even FBI agents and their law student daughters.